Coming to Jakarta, a poem about terror. 1-1. There are 3 desks in my office. At one, I read Virgil's Descent into the Underworld. At one, I try to sort out clippings of failed Swiss banks or of slow killings on meat hooks in a well-guarded Chicago garage. But the 3rd desk, this one, is where the typewriter stares at me with only a sheet of white paper from which my blank mind is averted with an unmistakable, almost diamagnetic force as the page blurs to the size of a movie screen, watched by a captive amphitheater of all the letters there are, containing among them every poem the mean vaults at the back of my head would rather kill me than let go of. So I turn back now to mock them. Mosaic darkness, constellations of the Gulf's floor, naked half-limbs, swift alpine cloudburst, hail, and you, wind-driven ghost of snow, down the side of the dark oak outside my childhood window, with the blind flapping all night. Why are you here? Have you something to tell me? 1-2. In Watertown, Massachusetts, at 2 in the morning, the light Canadian novel does not help to calm the unsteady trees outside that have somehow become too much part of my being. Or the uprising in my stomach against so much good food and wine, America? Or was it giving one last broadcast too many about the Letellier assassins, the heroin traffic, a subject I no longer hope to get a handle on and want so much to vacate, till I think of Noam, the East Timor massacres he cannot publish? Or was it those grim pre-election faces on campus, prepare to meet thy God, still visible under their freshly painted 10-foot-high Vote Reagan banners? Or just tonight's vigil with Henrik and Jerry in the new bar off Harvard Square, in the unused freedom of our Halloween Nixon masks, unable to decide between so many beautiful strangers? I think if I am sick now and cannot catch my 9:30 a.m. plane, will I lose hold forever of this thin, bright thread of my particular life, which hovers here in front of me like an apparition before I get it into perspective, leading trimly but without forgiveness through the departure gate? By its flicker, I discern the surly, rebellious trees beyond the muttering window, the maples, of course, of my childhood, but no more full of branches and black openings than the laurels out in California, have always concealed voices, too low and too obscene to be heard, except as revelations, like that face at lunch, surging with visionary insight as Jay smiled at me and brought his glass down again on the marble tabletop too dangerously hard. Or like the call from D with God's telephone number, who from exhilaration stripped for his angels in the Safeway parking lot and was held by the police till they learned he was famous. Of course, what are we if not haunted between these temples, the world never more full of imminent and transcendent glory than when it rises up over our heads, the future, the one thing that cannot escape us in front of our clumsy hands. 1-3. Taking off, the plane tilts nearby Cape Cod into a map of when I was 11. Before it heads north safely, above the clouds. My hand on the furtively sipped ginger ale can relaxes. I look down without nausea on the invisible peaks the stewardess is walking over. As if minutes, not sweaty years, separated them all. Chikarua, where I first broke out above a tree line. Washington, my head pounding with the fake clairvoyance of altitude. Lafayette, where silhouetted strangers led us back down through the dense surprise blizzard to the festive safety of the Dartmouth Outing Club hut. Already we are descending into these shadows which hang about as if there were something much more urgent left wholly unsaid. And we cross the supposed parallel which separates the Vermont end of Lake Memphremagog from Owl's Head, or Lake Massawippi, my protected childhood summers, the true north. The descent is bottomless. Even after I step out at Dorval Airport, strengthened by the sure pavement, the one November snowflake on my lapel, I listen to my "Un taxi, s'il vous plaît," and the comfort of this exotic self, unused for 2 decades, relaxes or jolts me still further out of space into untidy time, which cannot be just flown over, but engulfs us. I am piloted by the Greek immigrant taxi man through the departed woods of what was once the Côte de Liesse, towards my 74-year-old mother, my father who is 81, and I am so released as to forget tomorrow I will again be airborne. Losing hold seems for one moment to be no threat, but another beginning in the long voyage home to where we have never been.
This is Peter Dale Scott, poet, political researcher, former Canadian diplomat and UC Berkeley professor, reading aloud from his book-length poem, Coming to Jakarta. My name is Freeman Ng. I'm a former student, and together we hope to work our way through the entire book in this series of podcasts. Peter, thanks for agreeing to talk about your poem.
Oh, Freeman, thank you for your interest in it.
Now, I met you first as a student at UC Berkeley as an English major in attending some of your English department classes. Mm-hmm. And so I'm familiar, and at first, for a long time, that was the only area of your life that I knew about. You start the poem off discussing 3 areas of your life.
Right. You might have been in that office, actually.
At one point, yes. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about those 3 areas.
Well, there really were 3 desks. The third one was just a typewriter table. And it was true that I had one for where I kept everything to do with my teaching English. And then at the other table, it was all my deep politics research. And so I talk here, killings on meat hooks in a well-guarded Chicago garage. That was, in fact, a very famous murder. And then the third desk was just a little typewriter table. This was back in the era there actually was a typewriter with the amphitheater of letters, an office typewriter. That nest contained all the poems that the meme staying at the back of my brain would rather kill me than let go of. When I said that the page blurs to the size of a movie screen, that is pretty much what happened and what I was seeing. This poem was not written as part of a long poem. It was just, I was conducting a little experiment. Put in a piece of paper, don't think, just let the fingers make something come out. And as I did this, my mind started to change and became less focused. And as my mind became less focused, what I saw became less focused. And then it became the movie screen, and then all these images started bubbling up out of the back of my mind. This is what we call automatic writing.
Was there a reason why you were trying this?
Why was I doing it? Well, I think I was probably at a stage in life where I didn't think the kind of poetry I was doing was very good, so I thought I'd try writing a different kind of poetry. And right away, when this poem came out, I liked it. I shared it with Robert Pinsky, who was later poet laureate, but at the time was on our faculty. And he said, take the last two lines off, and the rest of it is just what you need. So I dropped the last two lines, thought I had a poem, but I didn't understand it.
The last two lines of this...
first section.
Why are you here? Have you something to tell me?
Yes, and then I came back to the real world and heard the banging of the radiator pipes in the room. But he said, don't come back to the real world, just end where it is. And so I had something which, what had happened in the course of this, I went through all these crazy bits of language which ended up with swift alpine cloudburst hail. There was actually hail falling on me in the Alps in the midst of a thunderstorm, and there was lightning too, which I don't mention here, but the hair on the back of my head went up from the lightning. It was very nearby. And then you, wind-driven ghost of snow down the side of the dark oak outside my childhood window. I had actually brought up out of my unconscious this real memory of when I was 8, and there was a snowstorm, I guess suggested to me by the Alpine hailstorm. And I was a very young boy, and I thought I saw a ghost coming to me. It was the snow on the side of the tree, but it looked like a ghost. And at the age of 8, I knew it was snow on the side of the tree, and I was also terrified because I also thought it was going to come straight into the room. I did stay up most of the night and ended up with the flu. I got sick from this episode. My mother was not pleased. Now, in long poems, they usually begin with an invocation. And I didn't begin to have the idea of a long poem until some weeks later when I had this horrible night in Watertown, Massachusetts. But once I started writing that, I realized that the first poem was, in fact, an invocation. And I do think that, in a way, you asked why I did it. I was opening up my mind to something different, even though I didn't know it at the time. It was going to be more than this one poem, but I didn't know that.
The hail is kind of a hail.
Right.
Hail ghost.
Yes,
hail,
exactly. It's hail dropping, but it turns into hail you. Yes, exactly. So that's, we don't have time to go from word to word to word, but there is actually, I think, you can trace these connections. It's very difficult for the brain, as opposed to a computer, for the brain to jump from one word to another word that has no association. There are the little neurons there that do it. And if you, in a poem, you want to get back to letting the neurons do the choosing rather than the frontal lobes doing the choosing. And that's what is happening in this little sequence here.
And one of the results of it is just really great poetry. I want to make sure that in the course of doing these podcasts, I repeat often enough the fact that I think this is just aside from the importance of its content, that it's just a wonderful poem. It's one of my favorite poems, this book. And I love this section. I love the velocity of this section, exactly the way that the sparks fly from neuron to neuron. My favorite little technical aspect of the lines is just the placement of the word swift, for example, at the very end of the line like that. Naked half limbs, swift alpine cloudburst. The lines are swift. It's wonderful poetry.
It begins to accelerate at this point in the poem. Yes, it does.
So, although Pinsky had a certain evaluation of it as a standalone poem, part of you knew that it was going to be longer. Part of you knew...
Not then.
Not then. But in the writing, part of you...
No, I thought I had a complete poem. And in fact, I'm not sure now, but I think it was some time. Then I started writing the part from Watertown, Massachusetts. And for reasons we haven't got into yet, I started writing a whole lot of sections very quickly. And at some point in writing all those sections, I realized that the first poem that originally I thought was independent then belonged with this sequence.
Right. And suddenly the last two lines of the section do work in the context of the longer poem.
Right. But even when I fitted it, I'm not sure that I saw immediately that it was an invocation. Hail, that is an invocation.
Right. Everyone knows that you've got to call upon the Holy Spirit or whatever at the beginning of these things.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah.
Well, let's move on to Waterton. What was the situation there?
Well, I had had too much to drink. That's part, and I was very frightened that I was going to throw up. And maybe I had a very vulnerable stomach in those days. It was quite frequent that I could be incapacitated for 24 hours by throwing up. So the immediate fear was that I would miss my plane to Canada, and that would mean I would miss my next plane, which was the day after that, to fly back to Berkeley, and it would be one huge miss. But that fear, which was a totally, what you might say, a sensible fear, because it became something much more irrational. It was just a fear about that life, and that I might go insane. That was the next step. And it got even worse than that. It was that my life has always been insane, and that I've been, everything I've done is a mistake. And so it was a terrible dark night of the soul in Watertown. And maybe I should say, I say in this part of the poem, now giving one last broadcast about the Letellier assassins, the heroin traffic, the subject I no longer hope to get a handle on and want to vacate till I think of Noam's East Timor massacres. That afternoon that I got drunk, I had seen Noam, and I'd said, Noam Chomsky, and I'd said to him, Noam, I've just had a book suppressed by my publisher. And Noam said, that's so odd. I've just had a book suppressed by my publisher. The difference was that his book had come out and then, no, his was also suppressed. He had to get a second publisher, and the book that was suppressed in my case never came out at all. The poem will talk about that later on. Well, I had put a year of work into that book, and it was, as I say in the poem later on, it was in the pocketbook spring catalog. You can see a picture of it. And then no book, all that work for nothing. And then it made me think that really all the research I'd done for 10 years that was in the background of that book, all for nothing. And giving the broadcast, I had also given this broadcast about the heroin traffic. I did a lot of broadcasts of that kind. They made absolutely no difference to anything. So suddenly I had the good sense to see that my life didn't make sense. And that was very scary. And then in this section, I think of other people. I was scared I might go insane. And then I think of two of my other friends who really did go insane.
That could have been your fate had you only had the first two desks.
Well, that's right, because I don't know, I don't want to get too far ahead in this poem, but writing this poem was a healing process for me. And first of all, to get well, I had to realize I was sick. And at this stage of it was the awareness that something's really wrong.
Right. But at this point, you don't even know what the whole long poem is going to be about yet.
No, I don't even know there's going to be a whole long poem.
So I want to move on to 1.3, where there occurs just another one of my favorite passages of poetry in the world, and that is the image of the stewardess walking over the invisible peaks because she's really walking down the aisle of the plane, which is flying over the invisible peaks.
Flying over the White Mountains.
I've just always loved the poetry of that image. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the two lakes.
I use the lake because that's where this all comes later, but I met people from the CIA for the first time. That they would come up from America to spend their summers at Lake Massawippi, or there was a woman who figures later on, Lily Dulles. I first heard the name of John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles from Lily Dulles before those two names were household names, because they were not yet head of CIA and Secretary of State under Eisenhower. There was some, I had a little view into the higher levels of American society because they liked to come for their summer holidays we'll talk about that when we get to it.
I was wondering if we could go out with you reading again, just maybe the last section, the last few stanzas, again, in which we once again immerse ourselves into something like the epic, something like the classical.
I say I'm piloted by the Greek immigrant taxi man. My taxi driver took me in to see my father and mother. He really was a Greek. And of course, it evokes the idea of people going into the underworld and being taken across the river by Charon, who takes people in a boat across the river Styx into the underworld of the realm of Proserpina. Persephone, I should say, seeing we're in Greek. The descent is bottomless. Even after I step out at Dorval Airport, strengthened by the sure pavement, the one November snowflake on my lapel, I listen to my "Un taxi, s'il vous plaît," and the comfort of this exotic self, unused for 2 decades, relaxes or jolts me still further out of space into untidy time, which cannot be just flown over, but engulfs us. I am piloted by the Greek immigrant taxi man through the departed woods of what was once the Côte de Liesse, towards my 74-year-old mother, my father who is 81, and I am so released as to forget tomorrow I will again be airborne. Losing hold seems for one moment to be no threat, but another beginning in the long voyage home to where we have never been.